Hello! We are in the last day of the series of the Core 4 for Pandas and Pans from my book, A Light in the Dark for Pandas and Pans. Today we're going to go through how do we put all of this together. We've gone through, if you've had a chance to watch any of the other videos, you might have your head spinning a little bit right now. And I'm sorry about that. And I did say in my book, like, that's okay. You don't have to do everything. A normal tendency is when you finally find something that resonates with you and information that you've been looking for, and you're like, yes, this is what we've been waiting for, then what you want to do is everything at once. And don't do that. Keep the excitement, get your resources, get organized, and then I highly recommend kind of putting this, I do a lot of highly recommends. I recommend putting this together in kind of three things. Think about these. Keep it simple, really simple. Keep it selective. You don't want to be, everything that I've mentioned. The intention is not that everything that I've mentioned in the Core 4 needs to be used. What we want to be doing is kind of as sparse as possible. So simple, selective, sparse. Because then you know if you add one thing at a time and you wait, then you kind of have an idea of what did that do for your child. When you add a bunch of things at one time, you won't necessarily pick up on the subtleties, and it may not be doing anything for your kid because that's not something that they need. And then you're just wasting money and you're wasting like social cred with your kid because they know their intuitions, they know when something is working, something is not. So this is all in chapter 10 in my book, A Light in the Dark for Pandas and Pans. What we do in that chapter is I show you all of it in one visual, and then we talk about how I might put it together. I am all about empowerment of parents. All about it. You are your child's greatest authority. You are the one that knows them better than anybody. Better than your doctor, better than a family member with an opinion, better than me sitting here talking to you because I've never seen your kid. And even if I am your kid's doctor, you are still your child's greatest authority. So this is meant to be a guideline so that you do take it very stepwise and careful and don't flare your kid. So we're talking about how to put it all together, and then at the end I'm going to talk about, or when I'm all done talking about putting it together, we will talk about some herbs that I have seen be problematic for kids. Even though they make sense on paper, it's good for the brain, can actually cause more problems with the brain chemistry piece of it all. So before I do that, I'm going to answer any questions that have come in because I promised today would be Q&A. So we want to get to all of those. What if you live in humid Mississippi where mold is probably everywhere in some ways? Manage your indoor spaces. Indoor humidity is the number one thing. We give mold food. All of us have houses that are made of mold food, but not all of us have mold in our houses. And the difference is humidity. So even if you live in Arizona, you need to be managing your indoor humidity. And what I recommend for my patients is to get those tiny little humidistats. You can get dial looking ones like for reptile cages, really cheap at like pet stores and big box stores. You can get a digital one, get many and put them in each of your rooms. And then you get to know your house and where are your rooms that have a little more humidity problem and which ones don't. And then you can run the dehumidifier in those problematic spaces and manage the humidity to be, we target between 50 and 55% ideally. Now in my area, I live in a very humid area too, and so rarely am I getting under 55, even with good commercial dehumidifiers, but that is a good maintenance step. So don't feel disempowered by where you live. You can take action steps. All right. Can you change the susceptibility versus location of raising a family? It does reduce, you can have reduced environmental toxins. So how we got here to Pandas and Pans, mold is part of that story. That's why I'm talking about it. So how we got here was a kid's immune system was faced with a challenge that it wasn't up for the challenge. It was faced with an infection when it wasn't up for the challenge. And what sets the stage for that not being up for the challenge, the immune deficiency, is our environmental toxic load. And there are a number of them, and depending on your kid, there might be something, completely that I'm not talking about. But the big four that I do talk about that I see in a lot of cases is weed killer or glyphosate or Roundup, all the same, mold, EMFs, and mercury. These are things that I have seen trip the trigger for a kid just getting a normal cold or a bout of the flu or mycoplasma pneumonia or reactivated Lyme. Reactivated Lyme happens a lot because mold is very immune suppressive. That all of a sudden the body went, I've lost immune discernment. I'm just going to start firing at everything. And that's where we get the autoimmune disease. Why the brain? Those particular things can ride a nose elevator up to the brain and can affect the brain stem in exactly where we see autoimmune activity, or at least destruction of receptors. So we're assuming it's autoimmunity in the child's brain. Okay, so can you change the susceptibility versus location? You can, if you want to listen to yesterday's, which was guard the gates, and the day before, which was regulate immunity. These are things that help build the resilience. So you have a kid who can have a normal tooth come out or a normal cold, and they don't, or even COVID. COVID's been a huge inducer of these conditions. Then they don't have to trip into the autoimmune. As far as location, there are some locations that are more ideal that manage those four things. So there are locations that are not near farm fields using tons and tons of weed killer. Thankfully, that has been taken away for residential use very quietly. They were very, very quiet about that. But it can still be used commercially. So if you're near a lot of farm fields, if weed killer was your thing that tripped the trigger, like a classic one is a kid who's playing soccer, goes and plays a game on a freshly sprayed field, gets a cold wind invasion. This is like an old-timey term. Gets a sore throat, gets a cold, and then that double whammy is the thing that then triggers to go into PANDAS or PANS. PANDAS is strep that starts it. PANS can be any number of things, and it doesn't even have to be infection. It can be that acute, huge dose of Roundup at the soccer field that can start this. So it doesn't always have to be infection. So you can manage those things. So if Roundup is the Achilles heel of your kid, get to a place where you don't have a lot of that happening. So not a farm field, not farm country. If mold is, obviously mold's an Achilles heel for everybody. So being in a less humid environment will help, but it doesn't seal the deal because we all live in the same kind of indoor environment. So managing your indoor environment is very important. There are people though that say that, I just didn't ever feel well when I lived in that really humid area. It's funny though, we have to remember if we live in a humid area that has a lot of nature, the cedar trees, things like that, they are emitting essential oils all the time. So if you can live with nature in these environments and foster a relationship with nature, nature is actually helping to heal you to manage living in that environment. So if you do live in like Pacific Northwest, the more you can have the natural things around you that are emitting those good essential oils, the easier that will be for you to make it in those areas and be okay. So if it's number 3, EMFs, okay, so if EMF exposure was the thing that is your kid's Achilles heel, living in a multiplex apartment and having a school that's in a multiplex school, so big buildings, big city, lots and lots of interfering Wi-Fi, that's going to be a harder thing. Let's say their bedroom is near the smart meter on your house. That's not a good thing for a PANDAS PANS kid who has EMFs. Mercury is not only the dental, but you can get it in exhaust from cars, vehicle exhaust. So kids tend to do better, if that's their Achilles heel, they tend to do better away from cities where you're going to have a lot of PM 2.5, which means particulate matter 2.5, which tends to carry a lot of the mercury. So those are some things that you can kind of just be thinking about, like for setting up the location. And doesn't it sound like we should all like live on little farmettes, non-sprayed area with woods around us, right? Like that would be perfect. That's my dream for everyone, is that we can get back to more of an agrarian lifestyle like that. All right, anything for ADHD type symptoms? Definitely. ADHD type symptoms are very common with pandas and pans, and adult ADHD is very common with mold mycotoxin exposure, specifically the ones that go through the blood-brain barrier, such as chitomium and eniotin. So if those show up on your mold test, those are a precursor to having attention deficit. And the hyperactivity comes from the neuroinflammation. And in a PANDAS PANS kid comes from the fact that the dopamine receptor is destroyed now. So their brain is running on very high dopamine, which is very excitatory. And that's where we get the obsessions, compulsions, tics, and some hyperactivity. However, in some kids, it makes them fall asleep, makes them kind of sluggish and sleepy. Do I think being on a meat and cooked veggie diet is the best mold diet? That has been the experience for a lot of my patients. Yeah, and intermittent fasting if you can do it. That helps with the leptin resistance. Have I seen families with multiple children with varying degrees of PANS? Yes, and it's more the norm than the exception. There are quite various levels of PANDAS and PANS. You're going to read about in the books all the serious cases, but there are a lot of mild cases running around because we have so much of the environmental insults. And since COVID, with everybody being exposed to this, we're seeing a lot more of these subclinical, that if you can get it when it's there, it's a lot easier to turn around than once it's become the more exaggerated cases. We found the main culprit trigger in our case was toxic mold. Sorry, that's so common. It started with a bad C. diff infection. Can toxic mold cause C. diff? Yes, there are certain mycotoxins that are correlated to a higher risk of C. diff infections because of how they affect the albumin, such as ochratoxin and citrinin. All right, I'm going to see if we have others, and then I'm going to get to the how to put it together. Have I seen kids develop PANS after their pediatric vaxes and mold exposure? Yes. Yes. Not trying to get myself bumped off of any any way to be able to communicate with you, YouTube and Instagram and the whole G Mafia. So yes, and I highly encourage people to check out the Children's Defense Fund website. Thoughts on LDN for a 3-year-old boy, PANS, triggered by mold, have been out for 5 months now, hesitant to do IVIG with 3-year-old before exploring other options. I agree with you. I would get going on at least the things I have laid out in my book. So let's get to that. Like, how do we put it all together? I would kind of wait on things like LDN and IVIG for a 3-year-old. I think there are plenty of things that we have in our toolbox that, you know, try those first. I'm not against LDN and IVIG, but I think, you know, at that young of an age, there's still a lot of pliability there. And you may be somebody who also, since you had mold in the picture, you may also find benefit from my mold in kids course, because it will handle the mold part, since the mold is the trigger. Mold is setting the stage. And just make sure, like, wherever your kid is spending time, no weed killer. Like, talk to schools. I have parents that have changed, you know, how the schools are treating their school grounds, how sports fields are treating those, that kind of thing. So, okay, what's the protocol to start with? Any tips? I have a whole book about this. So this is in chapter 10. I am going to show you, I have to find the page number that this is. I didn't prep that. What? 47, if you're learning along. Okay, 147, 6 and 47 show you every single tool that we have talked about in these days. And then there is a chart or a steps of how I put all of this together. So we have the very first thing, step 1, is select one of the flame tamers and one mast cell manager, which we talked about on day 1 in the core 1. So those are both in Tame the Flame, the first core treatment. And that would be one of each of those just to start. So when we're talking about a 3-year-old, like, holy moly, there's a lot we can do. And I talked about on the core 1 day, Often I'm using multiple of those things, but I'm just trying to give you the idea of like how I would do let's say someone who isn't needing hospitalization. So this would be, it could be severe, it could be mild, but it's just real, like, let's just do this, and then we see how things go. Now, if I have a kid who's in a massive acute stage, I'm going to use the conventional way to manage this with anti-inflammatories, maybe get them on antibiotics, that kind of thing, the drug kind. So what is the book? The book is A Light in the Dark for Pandas and Pans. And you can get that on anywhere you'd like to get books, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. If you're in Canada, then it's Indie Bound. If you're not in the United States, the ebook is available in most countries through Amazon. Okay, so step one of how we put it all together, we take one flame tamer and one mast cell manager and start there. Now remember, this is a patient process. Oh, thank you. It says the book is so good. Good. That's what I want to hear. I worked really hard to make sure you can actually take action. All right, step two is we choose one or two of the botanical avatars that we talked about in the core to beat the bugs. Why would I use two? Because some of them make the kid more alert and some of them make the kid more sedated. So you might need to use one in the morning, that's the more alert one, and then the calmer one in the evening when you're trying to get them to sleep. Now, some kids need the sedating one before school because they have so much anxiety. So, the one or two botanical avatars. So now we have things to calm the flame, and then we start the foundation with the botanical avatars. The botanical avatars set this nice, broad stability. It's so important. They are creating like this rock solid foundation for your child. They have many mechanisms of action. So often when you have a good match of a botanical avatar that's going to help beat the bugs, but also as the foundation, then you don't need as much of the other stuff because they work in concert with each other. Okay, step three, I add a botanical. Usually I start with a botanical, meaning herbal antibiotic or antimicrobial that fits the infection burden that the kid is dealing with. So if it's something like congenital Lyme, we would use something different than the plants for strep. Or if it's Epstein-Barr virus, a teen that has mono, we're going to use more antivirals than a kid who has a parasite. So we can target the botanical antimicrobial to whatever critter the kid is dealing with. Or maybe it's chronic Bartonella, and so we're trying to address, which, by the way, I wanted to make one of my chapters called Pots, Pans, Pets, and Mold because so often those are the problems. We have a kid who develops pots, they have pans because their pet gave them Bartonella and they were in mold. Like those four are so common with these PANS diagnoses. Okay, so the botanical antimicrobial, I start there. So now I've tamed the flame, put a botanical avatar there. We've added some extra antimicrobial that fits the burden of the child. And then we regulate immunity, which is core 3, with some vitamin D. So step 4 is optimizing vitamin D. And I do that by lab values. So it does involve a blood draw, which some kids can or cannot do. So, there are lots of tips and tricks that we can do for pre-blood draw to calm everybody down. The Alight Health has one called At Ease. It's a pump and it's really fast acting because it's liposomal. It goes right to the brain. That's what we will do before a blood draw. And then homeopathic Ledum, Ledum, in a 12C or a 30C, put some pellets under their tongue. This has really helped get blood draws in kids that have a lot of anxiety. Okay, so optimizing D to the blood values. What did I miss saying? Oh, and I am medical director for Alight Health, so I just want to be really very transparent with you that I have an interest in that company, and that's the reason I love their products, is because they're letting me formulate things for mold sick people who have other neuroinflammatory conditions. Okay, so step 5, add the support to regulate immunity on top of the vitamin D. So vitamin D would be the basic immunity nutrient. And then typically what we're trying to do is grab another thing that's going to boost the immunity that is specific to the kid. In the first Core 4 video on Monday, I really talked about the whole microbiome, how the microbiome is really the linchpin, I guess, for whether a kid is getting better or not. We are more microbe than man. There is more cell to cell. If we did a count of the microbes in our gut and the cells of our body, there are more of them than there are of us. And when we see studies, like there's a great mouse study where they had obese mice and lean mice, and they changed nothing else. They didn't change their activity. They didn't change their food. And they took the microbiota from the guts of the lean mice and gave it to the obese mice, and the obese mice became lean. So our microbiomes, yes, this will be posted. This will be recorded. Our microbiomes run the show. So if you have a messed up microbiome, guess what does that? My big four: weed killer, Roundup, glyphosate, mold, EMFs, mercury. Mess up the gut, mess up the microbiome, and that's how it turns into autoimmune, because we know what the other guys are, that's germs, but then the immune system can't tell what is self, because what determines self is our microbiome. And if it's all messed up, then it doesn't know what's self and non-self, and it can attack self thinking it's other. Okay, so I typically, in step 5, even though I have vitamin D helping the immunity, I will add something like butyrate, which we talked about on Wednesday, regulate immunity, core 3. Step 6, there's only 7 steps, so hang with me. Step 6, I choose 2 methods from each of the gates to make sure that we're guarding the gate so we don't continuously tweak this kid's immune system. So I'll use 2 things that are going to work for nasal. I'll use 2 things that are going to work for the throat gate, and 2 things that are going to work for the dental gate. And then, of course, every family needs to be, thinking about the exposure gate. That's step 7. But step 6, why do I say 2? Not because you have to use 2 every day, because that's 6 things a day that you got to do with your kid. It's 2 because every day is going to be different. And every day a kid may say, yeah, I'll do the inhalation stick, but I'm not up for doing a gargle. Okay, so now you have options. So if you have those 2 things, or maybe, one of the dental gate things is, yeah, I'll chew the xylitol gum, but that Myrrh toothpaste is disgusting. I'm not up for it today. Okay, then you have something. Then you have something that's working to guard the gate. Step 7, final step, is explore the various ways to manage the exposures. Exposures meaning environmental, exposures meaning infection, exposures that, a lot of people are very, very freaked out about EMFs right now. It's finally, getting out there that they're a thing, they're an important thing. But don't be too worried. Just mitigate, So there are really, really easy things that you can do, like turning Wi-Fi off overnight. And again, getting an EMF meter and seeing, where is your child's head of their bed? Do they have EMF exposure while they sleep? If they're right on the other side of a smart meter, there's your sign, there's your problem, so you got to get them away from that. Okay. So what are the caution things? And then I'll get to questions. I'm trying to find in my own book, the caution herbs. So a lot of things that we would think, it's really good for the brain, are not necessarily good for a kid with PANDAS and PANS. Example, CBD. These are cautions. These aren't no. These are cautions. CBD in a number of the kids has created depersonalization and increased fears. And in some of those cases, that was irreversible until we were able to manage the brain chemistry to kind of get it turned over. Another one that is commonly used for gut health, because we talk about the microbiome a lot, is glutamine. While these kids are swimming in too much dopamine, too much glutamate, and that's what's causing the symptoms, the behaviors, and glutamine can be converted to glutamate in an already inflamed body. So if you have your kid on glutamine's good for the gut, well, yeah, but not good for a PANDAS PANS gut, because it can tweak the brain chemistry. I love to use melatonin for mold treatment, but in my mold in kids course, I talk about that it can affect puberty. So we want to make sure that we're not using too much melatonin in a kid. And in a kid that is pre-puberty or in the middle of puberty, I don't use more than 3 milligrams of melatonin. So we keep them safe. What are the other herbs that we would think really good for these conditions that we want to make sure that we're using caution to not use them during a flare, because a flare means excess dopamine. And we don't want to use any herb that is called dopaminergic, meaning it will increase dopamine. And this is going to surprise some of you. It's on the list. Turmeric, boswellia, both good for the brain, right? And we put a lot of people on that. I've seen these flare. When we do just single, that's why I add one thing at a time when we watch. That's how I learned this. My patients taught me this. When I put kids that are in a flare on turmeric, they got worse. Schizandra. Now those three, you parents should probably be taking because your dopamine is down in the toilet. So yeah, you need the dopamine. Your kid doesn't need the excess dopamine. And then some calming herbs that we would normally think are really good for just kind of settling things down, but not in a kid with PANDAS and PANS because they increase dopamine. That is, and I did this with my own kids, I messed up. Lemon balm. I remember giving my kids lemon balm when they were really little, and we were up all night. They were like, party time! You know, it's time to jump on the bed and have all kinds of fun because I put them on something that increased their dopamine. And in a normal kid, it will calm them. In a PANDAS PANS kid, not so much. So lemon balm, passion flower, hops, and kava, all calming herbs that when a kid is in a flare can blast them. Now, when they're between flares, they might really dive on dopamine and become in despair and depression. Then that's a perfect time to use the things that I just talked about. What else? Black cohosh, chaste tree berry, and St. John's wort. All dopaminergic and need to be used with caution. I learned from a mold account that lemon balm is a no. Oh, it's not a no for mold for me, but it is a no for PANDAS and PANS. In a flare. Again, in between, they may really need it, and you could save them from a moment of big time despair. All righty. What do you do when your 17-year-old PANS kid refuses supplements? Mold is a trigger. Hide it. Just like you'd have to do in a 4-year-old. Hide it in food as much as you can. I mean, we have done some massive adulteration. We've done Red Bulls. You know, I mean, sometimes you're just trying to get it in the kid. So, you know, get stealthy, parents. And what I like to do is save the containers of things that are like what all their friends are doing, and then just dump in the adulterated version of it and then put it in the fridge, seal it back up and put it in the fridge. Well, you know, yeah, go ahead, have a Snapple. I put stuff in it, right? You got to get stealthy. Someone's saying I had cardiac arrest with black mold. It is a cause of myocarditis. Even the Mayo Clinic says so on their website, although they rarely diagnose mold, which drives me crazy. Is the glyphosate toxicity mostly due to spray exposure, food sources? It can be anything. It can be environmental. It can be food. So I only have one food rule for PANDAS and PANS. Well, you know, there are probably perfect diets. A lot of these kids have food issues. And so the number one rule is just organic. Organic, organic, organic. You're going to make a huge difference in your kid's life if you get the organic food going. What about adults? Sorry, I don't know. Did Dr. Shoemaker test confirm SIRS? Oh, so for adults, I don't have my book, but can you see it in the background? I have a book called Break the Mold, and it goes through all the steps on how to get the mold out of your body. Make sure it is out of your environment. That is the thing that I see most people miss. How much vitamin D do I suggest? I do this based on if they're negative 20 nanograms per milliliter, that is low. That is like I think 13 is where we start to see scurvy. So that is very low, and I have no problem dosing a child in the higher ranges for a child for temporarily, and then monitoring labs to get them up. So I'm very comfortable with a low vitamin D using 5,000 IUs a day. Liposomal, if mold is in the story, liposomal forms of D are much more absorbable, and you're going to save money over time. But make sure if you're using that high of a dose, that your doctor is monitoring labs and we don't go too high, because we can store vitamin D and vitamin A. Recommended binder to sequester heavy metals as yeast is dying off, especially considering mercury is a trigger. Yeah, citronella is it's been shown in some studies. I know it's always this thing with binders and like, was that done in a petri dish or was it done in a human? That is a really common one to be using. And then their insoluble fibers are what we use for mold mycotoxins. Does mold cause PANS? Yes, it's one of the primary causes of PANS is mold exposure. And you do need to, 50% of people can get out of the mold and be okay. 50% of the people need treatment. And if it's tripped into PANS, that's a person who needs treatment, not just mold avoidance. All right, so we are at time. I did see a question on here. Am I taking new patients? And I am not. I am, the only way to work with me is in a group model where we have a membership. It's a beautiful group of people and they've all been here on the mold thing. And we have a lot of PANDAS parents there, PANDAS PANS. And also I have a PANDAS PANS Parents Book Club, which is a lot more hand-holding. And with that, you get 3 months of the membership. So you can kind of, you know, data mine all the stuff in there. So if you're interested in any of those, that's on my website or you can email me. And what we're going to be doing, I had a request from somebody to do a series like this on mold, which I'm very happy to do. I love to talk about mold. Love to spread the word. So not next week, but on the 20th, 21st, and 22nd, I'm going to be going through mold spores, spore fragments, and then mold chemicals like MPA. And we'll talk through my fact sheet on MPA, which we don't have posted to my website yet. We'll get that done so you guys can all download that. But we'll go through those 3. And then there are so many mycotoxins. I had to find a week where I had lunch available. And so at the end of March, we'll go through each mycotoxin and talk through each fact sheet for those as well. And we'll try and cover as much as we can till we run out of days and stuff to talk about. All right, thank you very much. Remember, parents, you are your child's greatest authority. Yeah, remember, and these kinds of things, a light in the dark, and other resources. Dr. Nancy O'Hara has an Instagram page. She has a great book. Dr. Bach has a great book. Get informed, take action, because you know your kid better than anybody, and be the light in their life. All right, bye. Mwah.